British imperialism and the annexation and Zionization of Palestine, 1917 to 1922. Ignorance, reflex, and disaster. My subject is one of the 20th century's most disastrous acts of statesmanship, and my purpose is to interpret this in the determining context of British imperialism. On November the 2nd, 1917, the Coalition British War Cabinet, a largely conservative body under the Liberal Prime Minister David Lloyd George, issued the so-called Balfour Declaration, announcing that they viewed with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The pledge was restated in the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, awarded to the United Kingdom in July 1922. Almost exactly 30 years on from the declaration, on 29th November 1947, when the mandate expired, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into two countries, one Jewish, the other Arab. Imperial administration had failed to satisfy the political demands of either Arabs or Jews, and Britain was forced ignominiously to abandon Palestine to its own misshapen devices. The Jewish portion became the State of Israel on 14th May 1948. The Arab portion was split into two parts, one based in Gaza and the other in the West Bank, the former falling under the control of Egypt and the latter of Transjordan. The succeeding Arab-Israeli war led to an expansion of Israeli territory and a mass exodus of dispossessed Arabs to neighboring states. Conflict, mainly to the military and political advantage of Israel, has been more or less continuous ever since. In Peter Mansfield's view, this apparently unsensational document, known as the Balfour Declaration, planted the seeds of a conflict which has lasted almost a century and is unlikely to be resolved before another century has passed. For Avi Schleim, in his Israel and Palestine, Reappraisals, Revisions, Refutations, just published, the consequences of Balfour were both profound and pervasive, and its impact on the subsequent history of the Middle East was nothing less than revolutionary. Jeffrey Lewis, in his 2009 book, Balfour and Weizmann, The Zionist, the Zealot, and the Emergence of Israel, makes his point succinctly. The declaration represented the triumph of an idea over all principle and reason. My basic purpose here is to trace this remarkably extended crisis back to its beginnings, its British imperial beginnings in 1917, and to appraise the quality of the decision-making that set the tragic succession of events in motion. Unusually, among major historical sequences, this process has a clear year zero, indeed a month and day zero. Zionist aspirations apart, there were no antecedents, no historical build-up over the years to a Zionist commitment on the part of the British government. And I've argued in another context that the policy was both historically regressive and historically improbable, totally unforeseeable at the outset of the First World War, still in doubt as late as the autumn of 1917, and dependent overall on a highly fortuitous combination of circumstances. And what is particularly arresting about the whole affair is this combination of great improbability with profound and enduring historical consequence. Once the policy was enacted, there was to be no turning back. When the British early in the 1920s came to sense the error of their ways, they could find no means of undoing the declaration or pull back the Zionist officials who had already made their way to Palestine to establish administrative fait accompli on the ground. Any attempt to moderate the policy in favor of the indigenous Arab population was invariably met with relentless Zionist opposition. There was also a matter of principle of sticking to one's promises. As the anti-Zionist British Foreign Secretary Lord Curzon expressed it in the early 1920s, the issue had now become one of consistency and self-respect, if not of honour. Those of us who have disliked the policy are not prepared to make that sacrifice. The Balfour Declaration, fateful consequences apart, manifested a number of notable peculiarities. In the first place, it was a statement of major government policy delivered not in Parliament or through some other official channel, but most unusually in the form of a private letter from the Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to one of Britain's leading Zionists, Lord Rothschild, Walter Rothschild. Secondly, it was decidedly premature. The British Army commander, General Edmund Allenby, had only very recently won the Third Battle of Gaza against Ottoman forces, and British authority after that success was still confined to the southern margins of Palestine. The territory as a whole was not comprehensively conquered until October 1918, the best part of a year after Balfour. Third, perhaps appropriately in these circumstances, the declaration was more aspirational than substantive in its promises. Consider the wording, the government viewing with favour, offering its best endeavours. Fourth, its terminology also conveyed the lethal imbalance in British official thinking concerning the respective rights of indigenous Arabs and immigrant Jews, the resident majority population, 90% plus, being described entirely negatively as non-Jewish, and the protection of their particular interests being confined to civil and religious rights, with the term political deliberately withheld. In Lord Curzon's words, the poor Arabs are only allowed to look through the keyhole as a non-Jewish community. And Arthur Balfour's blatant colonialist perspectives were clearly set out when he insisted that Zionists and their creed were, quote, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. The whole idea of planting a minority of outsiders upon an indigenous majority population without consulting it was not calculated to horrify men who worked with Cecil Rhodes or prompted European settlement in Kenya. Balfour did a special line in nonchalance. As he told the House of Lords in a Palestine debate in June 1922, I do not deny this is an adventure. Are we never to have adventures? Are we never to try new experiments? The problems of present-day Israel-Palestine are manifestly systemic. The fundamentals of Jewish and Arab behavior over the decades really carry few surprises. Tony Judd, in his recent volume Reappraisals, writes of two peoples, each sustained by its exclusive victim narrative, competing indefinitely across the dead bodies of their children for the same tiny piece of land. And this system itself was laid down open-eyed by the British in 1917 and the immediately succeeding years. Theirs is the ultimate responsibility, a fact rather obscured by the bulk of Arab and Israeli historiography. The system they introduced was, of course, thoroughly imperialist, not only in the sense that Zionist settlement was, as Edward Said, Joseph Massad and many others have argued, and Balfour himself confirmed, essentially Euro-colonialist in nature, and in the sense, too, that the British annexation of Palestine was, as such, clearly an imperialist act, subsequent mandate notwithstanding. It was also imperialist in a broader, more global context, inasmuch as the policy derived in large part, and I would say in largest part, from British concerns over the security of its sea route by way of Suez to its economic and military power base in India, sometimes called the All-Red route to India. The main threats seemed to come from Russia before the war, Germany and Turkey during the war, and France after the war. Palestine, and in particular the southern Palestine highlands, occupied a vital strategic position on the exposed eastern flank of the Suez Canal. Whoever controlled Palestine, the simplistic anxiety ran, was in a position to gravely compromise British power in India. Almost all historians writing about the Balfour Declaration over the last half-century and more make reference to this critical imperial strategic factor in British motivation. Invariably, however, they omit to back up generalized observations with detailed supportive documentation. And they also fail, oddly, to make any significant use of Hansard, the verbatim record of British parliamentary comment and debate. And they introduce an alternative consideration, namely the wish of British policymakers during the war to make sentimental, idealistic and political appeal to Jews around the world, most notably Jews in the United States, in the belief that in their gratitude for the possibility of a new British-sponsored Zion, they would use their peculiar influence to persuade their respective governments to more effectively assist the Allies in their efforts to win the war. Most historians cite both factors, usually without any significant comparison, the one against the other.